In the mid-1990s, North Korea was hit by disaster as floods wiped out farmland. The Soviet Union, its largest trade partner, had collapsed, and the government's food distribution system failed overnight. What followed was one of the worst famines in modern history, killing up to 3 million people across the country. Families were left with nothing, not enough food, no stable jobs, and no help from the regime. But out of that desperation, a quiet movement began as ordinary citizens created something the state couldn't control, a black market economy that became known as the Jangmadang. The Jangmadang, which means market grounds in Korean, didn't begin as organized trade but as small, desperate exchanges, neighbors bartering corn for soap, or a mother quietly selling foraged roots to feed her children. These early market spots were illegal under North Korean law, yet as the state's official systems crumbled, even local officials began turning a blind eye, because they too relied on these markets to survive. And what began as a few scattered blankets laid out on dirt roads, slowly grew into full-scale underground marketplaces, where you could find not just food, but eventually clothes, medicine, and even foreign media smuggled in from China. The state still refused to admit they existed, but across the country, people no longer waited for help from above. They started depending on each other. As the Jangmadang spread from one neighborhood to the next, what started as survival trade gradually transformed into a full underground economy that reached nearly every corner of the country. People began selling not only food, but used clothing from China, handmade soap, basic medicines smuggled from across the border, and even solar panels to power small radios and devices when electricity was nowhere to be found. Traders adapted fast. Someone would bring in cheap Chinese shoes, someone else would sell herbs as medicine, and before long, stalls were popping up in open lots, on train platforms, and behind government buildings. But perhaps the most dangerous, and most desired, goods were not things you could eat or wear, but ideas, carried through flash drives full of South Korean dramas, American movies, and foreign news. These USB sticks were hidden inside slippers, candy wrappers, or toothpaste tubes, passed from hand to hand late at night by teenagers who'd never seen the outside world, but who now knew it existed. So the Jangmadang was no longer just a place to buy rice, it became a doorway into another reality, one the regime never intended its people to see. While men were still required to report to their government-assigned factory or military posts, jobs that often paid in soap or promises instead of money, it was the women who quietly built the real economy. Mothers, widows, and grandmothers stepped into the Jangmadang with bags of homemade noodles or handfuls of vegetables, and soon, many of them became full-time traders, navigating risk, bribing officials, and managing entire supply chains from border towns to rural villages. Some started with just a few coins, or a sack of rice, but over time, a few became so successful they were able to build homes, educate their children, or even fund cross-border escapes for relatives trapped in poverty. This shift didn't just feed their families, it reshaped power inside the household, as women who once stayed silent under patriarchy became decision-makers, entrepreneurs, and leaders in their communities. In a society that gave them no official voice, they created their own economy, their own influence, and their own path to survival. Children who grew up during the famine, or in the years just after, never really knew a world where the government provided for them. They came of age watching their mothers sell rice in alleys, trade soap with soldiers, and hide USB drives full of forbidden stories. For this generation, the Jangmadang wasn't illegal, it was normal, even necessary, and many of them learned more about survival and human behavior in the market than they ever did in school. They watched South Korean dramas in secret, listened to K-pop on smuggled MP3 players, and saw ordinary people on screen laughing, shopping, and living freely, something they had never been told was possible. These quiet exposures didn't turn them into protesters overnight, but it shaped their thinking. They became more skeptical of the regime, more curious about the world, and less willing to blindly believe what they were told. This is the Jangmadang generation, young North Koreans shaped not by ideology, but by trade, risk, and whispers of life beyond the border. As the Jangmadang generation grew bolder, and the black markets became more central to daily life, the regime found itself trapped in a contradiction it couldn't easily escape, because the very economy that threatened their control was also the one keeping the country alive. Officials issued warnings, raided stalls, and set age limits for market sellers, but the reality was simple. Without these markets, millions would go hungry, and local power structures, including the military, depended on them too. They banned foreign media, but USBs still crossed the border daily. They punished traitors, but accepted bribes to look away. They condemned private profit, but quietly allowed their own relatives to benefit from it. In truth, the government no longer had a monopoly on information, food, or even influence. Those things had shifted, slowly but surely, to the streets and stalls of the Jangmadang. And while the regime still controls the headlines and the borders, it has lost something far more important: the complete obedience of a people who have learned to live without it. In a country where freedom of speech doesn't exist, where borders are sealed, and where even the truth must whisper to survive, the Jangmadang became something more than a market. It became a quiet revolution. It began with famine and desperation, but what followed was not chaos. It was creativity, resilience, and a determination to live on their own terms, even when the system offered nothing in return. Women built businesses, children found glimpses of the outside world, and a generation rose that no longer believed everything it was told. The government still claims total control, but the heartbeat of North Korea today doesn't come from its leaders. It pulses through open-air stalls, hidden flash drives, and whispered deals between neighbors. Because sometimes, the most powerful resistance doesn't come from shouting in the streets, it comes from quietly refusing to wait for permission to live.